I've told this story maybe 4 times in my life. Never the same way twice. That's how you know a thing really happened to you. The details move around a little, but the feeling underneath stays exactly where it was. I'll tell it to you the way I remember it tonight. My name doesn't matter much. People called me Tom back then. Tom Bellamy. 22 years I stood watch at Ashford Palace in the little kingdom of Wrenhaven, up where the winters come down hard off the northern hills and the wind finds every crack in the old stone. 22 years. I saw kings buried and children christened. I saw a lot of ordinary days, which is what most days are, even in a palace. And then I saw one that wasn't ordinary at all. But let me slow down, because if I jump straight to the fire, you won't understand the man in it. And this story isn't really about a fire. It's about a man named Owen Merrick, and the door inside him that stayed shut for 9 years, and the small voice that finally opened it. Let me start with him. The first time I met Owen, I thought he was the coldest young man I'd ever seen. He came to us in the autumn, 24, maybe 25. Tall, thin through the shoulders in that way that makes you think a man hasn't eaten enough as a boy. He had a face that didn't move. I don't mean serious, plenty of guards are serious. I mean still. Like a lake with no wind on it. You'd look at him and you couldn't tell if he was thinking about God or about breakfast. Nothing came up to the surface. Our sergeant at the time, an old bull named Harkness, took one look at him and said, "That one'll either be the best we ever had or he'll crack in a month." He didn't crack. You have to understand what our job actually was. People see the pictures, don't they? The tourists come and they see a man in the tall dark cap standing outside the gates, and they think the whole job is standing still and not laughing when some fool makes a face at you. And yes, that's part of it, but the real work is inside, behind the walls. The night watches in the corridors, when the palace goes quiet, and the only sound is your own boots when you shift your weight, and the old radiators knocking like something trying to get out. The stillness is the discipline. That's the thing nobody understands. Standing still while your legs scream is easy compared to standing still while your heart wants to move. A drunk climbs the fence, you hold. A cat knocks a vase off a ledge in the dark and it shatters like a gunshot behind you, you hold. Someone shouts 3 rooms away, you hold, until the order comes, because the order is the only thing that keeps a palace from turning into chaos every time a floorboard creaks. Owen was the best at holding I ever saw, better than me, and I was good. I remember a night that first winter when a storm brought a branch through one of the tall windows in the long gallery, glass everywhere, wind howling in, papers flying, a curtain torn half off its rail and snapping like a whip. I came running with 2 others, and there was Owen posted at the far end, not 10 feet from the broken window, and he had not moved. Rain was hitting the side of his face. Glass was on his boots. And he stood there, eyes forward, waiting for the word, because moving without the word was not his to do. I said to him afterward, half joking, "You could have stepped back, lad. Nobody'd have marked you down for a bit of glass in your neck." And he looked at me, that flat, still look, and he said something I didn't understand for years. He said, "If I start moving before I'm told, I don't know where I'll stop." I laughed it off, thought it was just youth talking tough. I know better now. We got used to him, the way you get used to a good tool. Sergeant Harkness put him on the family corridors, the inner watches, where the royals actually lived and slept, which is where you only put men you'd trust with anything. Because it's one thing to guard a gate. It's another to be 6 feet from the door of a sleeping queen and know that whatever happens on your watch is yours. That's how Owen came to be posted near the Queen. Now Queen Adelia. I've served under 3 crowns, and I'll tell you plainly, she was the best of them, and it wasn't close. She was old by then, silver hair she never bothered to hide, a slight bend coming into her back, hands that shook a little over her teacup in the mornings. But she had a warmth that filled a room before she did. You'd feel her coming down a corridor before you saw her, the way you feel the sun come out from behind a cloud. She knew all our names, Every guard, every maid, every cook, she knew mine. She'd ask after my mother, who was ill for a long time, and she'd remember from one month to the next, "And how is your mother, Thomas?" And she meant it. You could tell she meant it. There's a kind of person who asks how you are as a habit, and there's a kind who actually stops to hear the answer. She was the second kind. They're rarer than you'd think, even among ordinary people. Among the great ones, they're rarer still. The tourists loved her. On the good weather days, they'd line up along the black railings at the front of Ashford, and if she was driven out through the gates, she'd have the car go slow, and she'd lift her hand, and the whole crowd would light up like children. I've seen grown men cry at the sight of her going by. I never fully understood it until I lost her. Then I understood it completely. She had one great soft spot, and that was the little one, Princess Elise. Elise was, oh, she'd have been 6 that winter. 6 years old, and the whole palace revolved around her without admitting it. She was the Queen's granddaughter. Her parents were often away, duties, tour, the endless traveling that the young royals do, and so more and more the child was left in the Queen's care, and neither of them minded that one bit. They were thick as thieves, those two. The oldest woman in the palace and the youngest soul in it. You'd see them in the morning sometimes, the Queen walking slow along the garden path with a shawl around her shoulders, and this little girl skipping circles around her, talking a mile a minute, and the Queen laughing that low laugh of hers. Elise called her Nana. Not your Majesty, not grandmother. Nana. And the Queen, who half the world addressed with a bow, would answer to Nana quicker than to any of her titles. The child was frightened of storms. That's a small thing, but hold on to it because it matters. Whenever the thunder came down over the northern hills, and up in Wrenhaven it comes down like the sky is being torn, the little princess would not sleep in her own room. She'd pad down the corridor in her nightgown, dragging a stuffed gray rabbit by one ear, and she'd go and climb into the Queen's bed, and the Queen would let her, every time. The nurses would fuss. The Queen would wave them off. "Let her come," she'd say. "The nights are long enough as it is." I tell you all this so you'll understand the shape of the place. It wasn't a fortress full of strangers. It was a family, with the walls of a palace around it, and us, the men in the dark caps, standing in the seams of it, holding it all still. And Owen stood closest of all. Here's the strange thing, the child took to him. I don't know why. Maybe children see past the still face to whatever's underneath. Maybe she liked that he never fussed over her the way everyone else did. Elise would come skipping down the family corridor, and every adult she passed would coo and bend down and make a business of her. And then she'd reach Owen, standing at his post like a carved thing, and she'd stop and look up at him, and he wouldn't bend and he wouldn't coo. He'd just look down at her level, the way you'd look at a person. And for some reason, that's the one she liked. She had a game. She'd try to make him smile. She was 6, so her methods were what you'd expect. She'd cross her eyes, she'd stick out her tongue, she'd do a little dance. And Owen would hold. Of course he'd hold. It was his post. But I stood watch with him enough nights to notice a thing the child never caught, because she'd always give up and skip off before it happened. After she left, after her little footsteps had gone round the corner, Owen would smile, just for a second, to himself. Then it would go, and the still face would come back down like a shutter. I never said anything about it. Some things you leave a man to keep. I did wonder about him, though. We all did. A man that closed makes people curious. There were stories. There always are. Some said he'd been a soldier before the guard and seen bad things. Some said he came from money and had run from it. One of the younger lads swore Owen had a wife who died, though nobody could say where he'd heard it. I'll tell you what I knew, which was almost nothing, because Owen didn't talk about himself. Not once, not to me. In the years before that night, I knew he sent money home somewhere every month, faithful as the moon. I knew he didn't drink with us, though he'd come and sit and listen, and there was no unkindness in him, just a wall. And I knew, because I saw it once by accident, when his sleeve rode up as he reached for something, that the inside of his left forearm was scarred. Old scars. Shiny and pulled the way skin gets when it's been burned and healed badly. I never asked. You didn't ask Owen things. So that was the world. A good old queen, a small brave girl who was scared of storms, and a young man made of stone who smiled only when he thought no one could see, and carried a burn he'd never explain. Now let me bring in the night. It was February, the worst part of a Wrenhaven winter, when the daylight barely bothers to come at all, and the cold gets into the stone and stays there so the whole palace feels like the inside of a cellar. There'd been snow for a week, then a thaw, then more snow, and now a storm was coming in off the hills, the big kind, the kind the old gardeners could smell a day before it arrived. I was on the night watch, Owen too. We came on at 10 when the palace was already gone quiet. The family had turned in early because of the weather. The Queen's rooms were at the end of the East Wing, the oldest part of Ashford, with the little princess's nursery just across the corridor and down a few doors. I remember the walk to our posts. I remember it very well because I've walked it 1,000 times since in my head. The corridors of the East Wing were long and narrow, lined with portraits of dead Wrenhaven kings who all had the same disappointed look, as if none of them had liked how things turned out. The floor was old dark wood that had been polished by 300 years of feet, so it shone even in the low light. They kept the lamps dim at night, just enough to see by. And there were the radiators, the old iron ones, clanking and hissing, and the wind already starting to lean on the windows. The East Wing was a difficult part of the palace, and everyone knew it, and nobody had done much about it. The way you don't do much about the difficult things in an old house until it's too late. The wiring was ancient. It had been patched and patched again over the years, but never properly torn out and redone, because to redo it you'd have had to close the wing, and there was always a reason not to. The heating was the same, an old system, groaning along, held together by the two engineers who understood it and prayers from everyone who didn't. I mention all this now because later there'd be a great deal of talk, official talk, about causes and reports and who should have signed off on what. And I sat through some of that talk, and I'll spare you it, because none of it matters to the story. What matters is this. On a night when the storm was coming and the family had gone to bed, in the oldest and worst wired wing of Ashford Palace, something in the walls of the East Corridor had been quietly failing for a long time. And that night it finished failing. But we didn't know that. Not at 10, not at 11. At 11 it was just a cold, ordinary, boring night watch, the kind we'd both stood 100 times. I was posted at the top of the East Wing near the stairs. Owen was down at the far end, the deep end, right in the throat of the corridor where the family rooms were. The Queen behind one door, the little princess's nursery across and down, him between them and the dark. The thunder started around 11:30. I heard it before I felt it, a long, low roll away off over the hills like something big turning over in its sleep, then a gap, then closer, and I thought straight away of the little one, because I knew what the thunder did to her. I found out later I was right. Around that time, down at the far end, the nursery door had opened, and a small figure in a nightgown had come out, dragging a gray rabbit by the ear, and padded across the corridor to the Queen's door, exactly as she always did on storm nights. Owen would have watched her go. He'd have said nothing. It wasn't his to speak, but he'd have watched, the way he watched everything, and then gone back to holding. The child went into her nana. The Queen took her in, the way she always did. And for a little while, maybe half an hour, the storm rolled and the palace slept, and everything was exactly as it had always been. The lightning came closer. I remember one flash lit up the whole top of the corridor where I stood, white as noon, and then the crack of it came almost on top, so near it rattled the old glass in the frames. And I thought, that's a bad one. That's right over us now. I didn't know how right I was. Somewhere in the wall of the East Corridor, I've imagined it 1,000 times, though no one can ever really say, the old failing wiring gave out its last. Maybe the storm pushed it. Maybe it was only ever a matter of time. A spark in the dark, inside a wall stuffed with 300 years of dry dust and old timber. A small orange thing, no bigger than a candle flame, in a place no eye could see. and it began to grow. Here's the terrible thing about a fire in an old building. It doesn't announce itself. There's no alarm at first, not from the fire itself, just the quiet, patient work of it, eating along inside the walls where nobody can see, getting bigger and hungrier in the dark. By the time you smell it, it's already been alive a while. I smelled it at about 10 past midnight. It was faint, so faint I told myself I'd imagined it. You do that, your mind offers you the comfortable answer first. Somebody's fire down in one of the rooms, I thought. A candle, nothing, but the smell didn't go. It got a little stronger. And it was wrong, not wood smoke, not the clean smell of a hearth, but something sharper underneath it. A bitter, electrical smell. The smell of something that isn't supposed to be burning. I stepped away from my post, which I'll admit, and which broke every rule, but the smell had my legs moving before my head had decided anything. And I went to the top of the stairs and looked down the length of the east corridor. And I saw it. Down at the far end, the deep end, where Owen was, where the queen slept and the little princess with her. A haze, just a haze at first, hanging low near the floor, catching the dim lamplight so it seemed to glow. And in the haze, a thin line of gray climbing up the wall paneling like ivy, and at the bottom of it, small but growing, the first true orange of it. Fire coming out of the wall of the corridor, right between me and the family rooms, right where a man was standing at his post in the dark. I want to stop the story here for a moment, the way I have to stop it in my memory, because everything up to this point was still ordinary. Everything up to this point could still have been an ordinary night, and it never would be again. I opened my mouth to shout. I don't even know what I shouted. Fire, probably. Just fire, the oldest word there is for that feeling. And far down at the other end of the corridor, through the thickening haze, I saw Owen turn his head. I've thought a lot over the years about what those next few minutes must have been like from where Owen stood. I only saw the far end of it from the top of the stairs. He was inside it. Let me tell it as best I can, from what I saw and what he told me much later, in the one long conversation we ever had about that night. When I shouted, Owen turned his head and he saw what I saw, only much closer. The fire wasn't a haze at his end. It was already up the wall. The old dry paneling had caught, and once that goes, it goes fast, a sheet of it climbing and the heat coming off it in a wave you could feel from 20 feet. The corridor was filling with smoke from the top down, the way it does, a gray ceiling getting lower by the second. And the fire was between him and me. But more than that, and this is the part that mattered, the fire was starting to spread along the corridor in both directions, toward me, up the top end, and down toward the family rooms, toward the queen's door, toward the nursery. Now here is where you have to understand the man to understand what he did, or rather, what he almost didn't do. Because Owen's whole self, everything he'd built in 9 years, everything that made him the best of us, was one single command written into his bones. Hold your post. Do not move until you're told. The order is the only thing that keeps the palace from chaos. He had stood while glass rained on him. He had stood while the wind screamed. His entire discipline, the thing that had made him who he was the refusal to move before he was told. And there was no one to tell him. That's the thing people don't think about. In the pictures, in the stories, the hero just runs. But Owen wasn't built to just run. He was built to hold. And for a moment, he told me this himself, and I believe it was the hardest thing he ever confessed to me. For a moment, in that filling corridor, with the fire climbing and the smoke coming down, Owen Merrick did not move. He stood at his post. Because that's what he'd made himself into. He told me later that in that moment, something happened to him that hadn't happened in 9 years. He was somewhere else. He was in a small house, a long way from any palace, a long time ago. There was fire there too, and he was a boy, frozen, unable to move, while the thing that mattered most in the world burned in front of him, because his legs would not carry him, and his voice would not come, and he stood there and he lost her. I'm getting ahead of the story. You don't know that part yet. Neither did I that night. But that's where Owen went in that first frozen second, back to the worst thing that had ever happened to him, the thing that had made him into a man who never moved. Because he'd already learned, once, the lesson that moving too late is the same as not moving at all. He'd learned it the way you only learn a thing once when you're young, when it burns itself into you. So he stood, and the fire grew, and for one long, terrible second the story might have ended there, with the best guard in Wrenhaven standing frozen at his post while a palace burned, exactly as he'd frozen once before. And then the little princess screamed. I heard it too, all the way up at my end, over the growing roar of the fire, because a fire has a sound, a low, hungry rushing that gets louder than you'd ever believe, over all of it, a child's voice, high and thin and full of a terror that goes straight through you. She'd woken. The smoke had reached the queen's rooms. And the old queen, I have to tell this part carefully because it's the part that hurts, the old queen had woken too, and she was not a strong woman anymore, and the smoke was already thick, and she was trying, God bless her, she was trying to get the child out. But she was slow. Her legs were slow and her breath was slow, and the smoke takes the old ones fastest of all. And the child, 6 years old, in the dark, in the smoke, with the fire's light flickering orange under the door, the child did what any child does when the world becomes terror. She called for the one who kept her safe. She called the only name that meant safety to her. She screamed for her Nana. But that's not the name that came down the corridor. In her terror, half joking, she didn't scream Nana. She screamed the queen's name, the real one, the one she'd heard the servants use, the one that on any ordinary day she'd never have used at all. She screamed Adelia, the queen's own name, over and over, Adelia, Adelia, a little girl screaming a queen's name into the smoke. And that name, the queen's name in the child's voice, coming down the burning corridor. That was the thing that broke the door open in Owen Merrick. I saw it happen from the far end through the smoke. I saw him move. I have never before or since seen a man move like that. He didn't run the way you or I run. He went low and he went fast and he went straight into it, into the wall of smoke, into the heat, toward the fire, not away from it, toward the sound of that child screaming a name into the dark. I shouted at him, I did. I'm not proud of it, but it's true. I shouted, Owen, no, wait for the fire crews, wait for the order, wait, the way you shout at a man who's about to do something that'll kill him. Because that corridor was a death trap now. The smoke alone would take a man down in that space. And Owen went into it anyway, without a breath of hesitation once he'd started, and the smoke closed over him and I lost sight of him completely. I want you to understand what he was going into. I've been in fire since. It was made part of my job after to learn these things, and I know now what that corridor was. The smoke would have been black and thick enough that he couldn't see his own hands. The heat would have been like standing in front of an open oven, except the oven is all around you. Every breath he took would have been poison. And the fire was in the walls on both sides now, so he was running down a tunnel of it, toward a door he could only find from memory. But that's the thing. He knew that corridor better than he knew his own face. 9 years of standing in it, in every light and every dark. He didn't need to see. His feet knew the count of it, so many steps to the queen's door. He'd measured it 1,000 times without ever meaning to. And he went down it blind, one arm up over his face, the way you do, and he counted with his feet, and he found the door. The queen's door. He told me this is one of the few things he ever told me directly about the fire itself. He told me the door was hot to the touch, and he almost didn't open it because a guard learns, even a guard who's never fought a fire learns by instinct, that a hot door has fire behind it. But he could hear the child on the other side. He could hear her still calling that name. And so he opened it. Inside was worse. The smoke had filled the room. He went in low along the floor where the air is least bad, feeling ahead of him with his hands, and he found them. He found the queen first. She was down on the floor near the bed. She'd got out of the bed. She'd been trying to reach the child, and the smoke had taken her legs, and she'd gone down. And the little princess was beside her, on the floor too, because, And this is the thing I can hardly say even now, because the child had refused to leave her Nana. 6 years old in a burning room, and she would not leave the old woman on the floor. She'd stayed. She'd stayed and screamed for help instead of saving herself. Owen had two of them, and he was one man. I've thought about the choice he had in that moment more than I've thought about almost anything in my life. Because there was a choice, wasn't there? There's no getting around it. He could not carry both, not fast enough, not through that. And the honest, terrible arithmetic of it is that a man in that room had to choose who came first. I'll tell you what he did, and I'll tell you what the Queen did, because they did it together. And I think it's the finest thing I know about either of them. The Queen was still conscious, barely, and when Owen reached them, when she felt his hands, she used what breath she had left, and she had almost none, to push the child toward him. She pushed Elise into his arms, and she said one word. He told me the word. She said, her. Just that, her. An old queen on the floor of a burning room, with a guard's hands finally reaching her after her whole slow life of being served. And what she spent her last strength on was to give away her rescue, to push it to the child. Her. Owen took the girl. He had no choice. The Queen had made the choice for him, taken it out of his hands the way only she could, with a word he could not disobey, because it was, in the end, an order, the first and last order that ever mattered. He took the child up against his chest, and he turned, and he ran back the way he'd come, blind, counting with his feet, through the tunnel of fire, back up the corridor with the little princess pressed against him and her face buried in his neck. I saw him come out of the smoke. I'll see it till I die. The black wall of it at the top of the east corridor, and then a shape in it, low and staggering, and then Owen, coming out of the smoke with the child in his arms, both of them black with it, and him going down onto his knees the moment he was clear because his legs had nothing left. But even going down, he turned his body so that the child came down on top of him and not under him. Even then, even with nothing left. We took the girl from him. She was alive. She was coughing, which is the best sound in the world in that moment, because coughing means breathing. Someone had the fire crews on the way. They were coming. We could hear them now, the bells. Men were pouring into the east wing with whatever they had. It was chaos, the good kind, the kind where everybody's trying. And Owen, on his knees, black-faced, half-dead, looked up at me, and he tried to speak and he couldn't. His voice was gone from the smoke, but I read his lips. The Queen, he was saying, the Queen's still in there. And then he tried to get up. He tried to go back in. I want you to hear that. A man who had just done the impossible, who was on his knees with nothing left in him, who could barely breathe. He tried to get up and go back into the fire. For her. We held him down. It took 3 of us. And I'm ashamed of it, and I'd do it again because he'd have died. There was no going back into that. The corridor was gone, fully gone, a solid wall of fire now, and no man living could have crossed it a second time. We held him down while he fought us. Silent because he had no voice, tears cutting clean lines down through the black on his face, reaching one hand toward the fire like a man reaching for something falling out of the world. The fire crews got there. They did everything men can do. They were brave past any telling of it, I want that said, because they don't get the stories, and they should. But some things, once they start, can't be stopped, only outlived. They got the fire in the end. Near dawn. The east wing was a black ruin, the old dark corridor with its disappointed kings all gone to ash, the walls open to the gray morning and the snow coming down soft into the wet black wreck of it. They brought the Queen out at first light. I was there, I won't describe it. There are things a man sees that he keeps, and that's one of mine. I'll only tell you that when they brought her out, every man in that courtyard, soot black and exhausted and soaked to the bone, went still and took off his cap. Nobody gave an order. Nobody needed to. We just stood bareheaded in the falling snow while they carried her past. She'd spent her last strength on one word, her. And because of that word, because of it, a little girl was alive, coughing in a blanket in the arms of a nurse, calling now, quietly, over and over for her Nana. For her Nana who had pushed her toward the light, the palace was a long time healing. You can rebuild a wing. They did. It took 2 years, and they did the wiring properly that time, tore it all out down to the stone, and I stood watch in the new East Corridor eventually, and it never felt the same, and I was glad it never did. Some places should keep the weight of what happened in them. But a building heals faster than the people in it, and the people in it were a long time healing, and some of them never fully did. The little princess lived. That's the first and best thing, and I lead with it because you've earned it after part 2. Elise lived. She had a bad chest for a while, and she was frightened of the dark for a long time after, which who could blame her? But she lived. She grew up. She's grown now, a young woman, and she carries herself with a straightness that I like to think she got from her Nana, and I've no doubt at all that she remembers. Children remember the big things. They remember them their whole lives. She remembered Owen. But I'm getting ahead again. Let me tell you about Owen, because I promised you a door that stayed shut for 9 years, and it's time I told you what was behind it. Owen was in the hospital a long while. The smoke does damage you can't see to the lungs, and his were bad. There were days early on they weren't sure he'd keep them, but he was young and he was stubborn in that quiet way of his, and he pulled through. And when he was well enough to talk, really talk, not just croak, I went to see him. And for the first and only time in all the years I knew him, Owen Merrick told me about himself. I'd brought him nothing, which I regretted, so I just sat there like a fool. And after a while, out of nowhere, in that flat, quiet voice, he started to talk. I think he decided, somewhere in that hospital bed, that he'd carried it alone long enough. Or maybe it was just that the thing that had kept the door shut had finally been paid off, and there was no reason left to keep it closed. He told me about a small house a long way from any palace where he'd grown up. He told me about his sister. Her name was Mary. She was 6 years younger than him, which, when I heard it, put a cold hand on my heart, because 6 years younger than a boy of 15 makes a little girl of 6, doesn't it? A little girl of 6. The same age. I understood then, and I think you understand now, why the child in the corridor had reached the deepest place in him. Why that particular voice, at that particular age, calling out in that particular terror, had reached down through 9 years of stone. There'd been a fire when Owen was 15. In the small house. In the night. Bad wiring, he said, and he said it with a kind of terrible flatness. Bad wiring, the same 300-year-old sin that took the Queen, following him across his whole life like a curse. He'd woken to smoke. He'd got himself to the door of his room, and across the landing was his sister's room, and the fire was between them on the landing, and Mary was calling for him. She was calling his name. And Owen, 15 years old, terrified, a boy, Owen had frozen. He stood in the door of his room, and he could not make his legs cross the landing. He could not make himself go into the fire. He stood there, and he screamed for her to come to him, to run to him, but she was too small and too scared, and the fire was between them, and he stood frozen in his doorway while the landing burned, and he did not go to her. Someone pulled him out, a neighbor through the window. He fought them. Even then, even at 15, he fought to get back to her, but they pulled him out, and by the time anyone could reach her side of the house, it was too late. The scars on his arm, that was where he'd finally tried. At the very end, when they were dragging him to the window, he'd made one lunge for the landing, one, too late, and put his arm into the fire, and they'd hauled him back with his sleeve alight. That was where the scars came from. The mark of the one moment he'd tried, and how far too late it had been. He told me he'd made himself a promise after, lying in a hospital bed a lot like the one he was lying in when he told me. He'd promised he would never freeze again, but he was 15, and he didn't understand himself yet, and the promise came out crooked. Because what he built wasn't courage. What he built was stillness. He decided that the thing that had killed Mary was moving wrong, being ruled by fear, running the wrong way, acting on your own panicked instinct instead of on some clear, cold order. And so he made himself into a man who never acted on instinct at all, who held, who waited for the order, who kept himself so perfectly still that fear could never make him move wrong again. Do you see it? Do you see the terrible logic of it? He'd become the best guard in Wrenhaven, the stillest, the most disciplined, the man who held while glass rained on him, for the worst reason a man can have. He wasn't holding out of strength. He was holding out of a 9-year-old terror of what his own body might do if he ever let it move. "If I start moving before I'm told," he'd said to me, years before, "I don't know where I'll stop." I'd thought it was tough talk. It wasn't. It was the truest and most frightened thing he ever said to me. He was afraid of himself. Afraid that if he let the frozen boy move, he'd find out the boy was still frozen. And then a little girl screamed a name into a burning corridor. And the door came open. He told me, and this is the part I hold on to, the part I'd give you to carry out of this whole long story if you could only carry one thing. He told me that when he heard the child scream, he was 15 again and he was frozen again. And for 1 second he was back on that landing and he could not move. And then, he said, some part of him that had been waiting 9 years for exactly this stood up inside him and said, "Not again. Not this time. This time I go." And he went. He didn't save Mary. He couldn't. That was written a long time ago and no man can go back and change what's written. But that night in that corridor he got to be the man who did what the boy couldn't. He got to cross the fire. He got to reach the child. He got to carry her out. And I truly think that somewhere in the carrying of Elise out of that smoke, Owen finally carried Mary out too. 9 years late in the only way left to him. The way grief sometimes lets you pay a debt you can never actually pay, by paying it forward to someone else's little girl. He left the guard after that. His lungs wouldn't have let him stay anyway, but I don't think he'd have stayed regardless. He'd done the thing he was put on this earth to do, and he knew it, and there's a kind of peace in a man who knows that, even when it's cost him everything. I kept up with him after. We wrote in the way old soldiers write twice a year and never enough. He got better mostly. He got a small place out near the coast, a long way from any palace, and this made me laugh when I heard it, and then it made me not laugh. He became a fire warden. Volunteer. The man who checks the wiring, who tests the alarms, who walks through the empty buildings at night making sure. Of course he did. He spent the rest of his life making sure the thing that took his sister, and his queen would never take anyone else if he could stand between them and it. He never did marry. I don't think he needed to in the end. Some men give all their love in one great burst and spend the rest of their lives quietly warm from it. And Elise, the little princess, she never forgot him. When she was old enough, she found him, went to see him herself, out at his little place by the coast. I know because he wrote me about it, the only letter he ever wrote me that had joy running all the way through it. A young woman came to his door, he said, and he didn't know her, and she said, "You carried me out of the fire." And they sat and talked a whole afternoon. The man who'd lost a sister and the girl who'd lost a nana, two people the same fire had marked, finding each other again on the far side of it. She told him something that afternoon. She told him she remembered it. Not all of it, she was only 6, but she remembered the important part. She remembered being lifted. She remembered a chest to press her face into, and arms that didn't let go, and being carried out of the dark into the cold, clean air. And she remembered, she said, that she'd never once been afraid in his arms. In the middle of the worst thing that ever happened to her, she said, she wasn't afraid, because she was being carried by someone who decided she was going to live. He wrote that he'd had to put the letter down a while, when she said that, before he could go on. The Queen, Adelia, they honor her still in Wrenhaven. There's a garden where the East Wing's old wreck was, a quiet green place, and people go there. And every so often the story gets told again of the old queen who spent her last words saving her granddaughter, of the little princess who wouldn't leave her, and of the guard who ran into the fire. The tourists hear it now, along the black railings, the way they used to hear her laugh going by. It's become one of the palace's stories. One of the ones they keep. But they tell it wrong mostly, not wrong. They just tell the outside of it. The brave guard, the burning corridor, the rescue, all true, and all only the skin of the thing. Because what really happened in that corridor wasn't a brave man doing a brave thing. Brave men do brave things every day and God bless them. What happened in that corridor was a broken man being made whole in the last place you'd ever look for it, in the fire, in the smoke, at the exact spot where he'd been broken once before. What happened was a boy of 15, frozen on a burning landing for 9 years, finally getting the chance to move, and moving. I stood watch at Ashford Palace for 22 years. I saw kings buried and children christened, and one queen carried out into the falling snow while soot-black men took off their caps. I saw a lot of things. But the thing I keep, the thing I'll carry out of this life when the time comes, is the sight of Owen Merrick coming out of that black wall of smoke on his knees, with a living child held to his chest, and his own body turned to shield her, reaching one hand back toward the fire for a queen he couldn't save, and weeping and alive. We spend our whole lives, most of us, standing at our posts, holding still, waiting for someone to tell us it's all right to move. Owen taught me the thing I'd never have learned on my own, standing beside him all those years. He taught me that the order you're really waiting for doesn't come from any sergeant. It comes from somewhere deeper, and it only ever says one thing, and it says it once, and God help you if you don't listen. It says, now, go now before it's too late. He heard it in the end, 9 years late and right on time. And a little girl lived because he did.